Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I'm doing a recent reading update. I basically filmed these when I've read enough good books to tell you guys about them. This is as close as I'm ever going to get to doing wrap-ups again, and I kind of like how I'm doing it because I'm basically only telling you about the books that I'm like excited about, not all the books that were just kind of like meh or DNFs or ones that I would just like forgot already. So I'm going to scroll back to basically whatever I last talked about in my last reading update, and we're gonna go from there. So, okay, well, this is gonna be brief because it's book 3 in a series, but I finally did read Savage Hearts by J.T. Gessinger, which is book 3 in the Queens and Monsters series. Books 1 and 2 are Ruthless Creatures and Carnal Urges, this series is steadily becoming one of my favorite and most recommended to you guys series of all time. If you're like looking to get into darker romance, it's not super dark, but it does have some questionable things that take place during it. Or if you're looking to get into mafia romance, this series is just perfection. The heroines in this series are just like some of the best female leads that I've ever read. I could probably be totally fine reading stories about just the women in this series and like screw the men. I don't need them. I would like them there though. But like the women in this series is just impeccable. So this one we were actually following. You know what? I'm not going to spoil it at all. It's a character I didn't expect to see, but it's very similar to Sloane, who I love. Sloane is probably my favorite, like, female main character that I've ever read. I just adore her to pieces, and this character reads very similarly to her. Like I said, this is book 3 in a series, so I can't really tell you much about, like, plot stuff, but this is a very, very fun, addicting mafia romance series, and at this point, we're basically kind of seeing more to the bigger picture rather than just the sole focus of like a singular relationship. Obviously, it's a romance, so the romance is what's going to move the plot forward, but we're starting to see all the moving pieces of all of the characters that we've kind of been meeting over the past couple books. It's so good. I loved it so much. So if you haven't picked up this series yet, now would be a great time because book 4 got announced. And I think we know who book 4 is going to be about, which is going to be interesting. It was a character that I didn't really like, the direction that he went in this most recent book, but I'm ready for his story to be redeemed. That is all. Speaking of Gessinger, so I finally read Perfect Strangers by J.T. Gessinger. This is a standalone that I have been seeing kind of just in the book community in general. I see it on TikTok a lot, but I've seen it mentioned briefly here and there all over the place. It's a book that came out a few years ago. I think it came out in 2019. And this is similar to Whispers and the Roars by Kate Webster, as in the only recommendation that I took about this book was the fact that everybody said go into it absolutely blind, and you were either going to love it or you're going to hate it. I loved it. It was one of those books where it just like, it was plot twist after plot twist after plot twist, and it was just kind of one of those things where I was like, what is happening? I went in not really trying to figure out what was going on because I knew there was going to be a big reveal of some sort. And like the whole first half of the book just reads like a good whimsical vacation romance. And I was like, what's coming? Oh, little did I know. It was just like a, oh, but wait, there's more moment after moment after moment. It was a lot. And it was one of those books, I listened to it in one go, in one night at work. And by the time I got home from work, I was just like, I need a drink. I don't know what I just listened to. It was thoroughly enjoyable. But one, don't go into it expecting to be, like, romanced. It's a romance, but, like, go in expecting it to just be, like, a wild ride. That's all I'm gonna say. Okay, definitely go into that one blind. Thoroughly enjoyed myself. Doesn't really have reread value, so I don't really know what that says, but, like, it was a ride. Okay, taking a turn to a book that I mentioned that I got like a month ago, and I have been steadily reading it in very small chunks, like in the morning for like 15 minutes at a time. I read The Beauty. This is by Elia Whiteley. What was this? I feel like a couple of you guys commented on the video that I hauled this in and said they also read it and they've never seen anybody talk about it, so this is just me talking about it. Not because I liked it, but I didn't dislike it either. So this author writes specifically like horror short fiction. Most of her works are all just like short stories or little like essays or anthologies of short stories, and they are all weird. Like, it's horror, so I knew what I was getting into, but like as I was reading this, I was just like, what am I reading? So short synopsis of this brief little tiny weird nugget of a book. It takes place in a world where all of the women died. And we're obviously following immediately after that, because obviously, like, reproduction can't really continue for very long after all of the women are gone. So all of the women contracted this disease and they all died. So we are following this group of men who are basically, like, living at, like, a campsite, who are trying to just, like, keep morale going. And basically this, like, yellow fungus starts growing on the graves of all of the women. And lo and behold, this fungus starts to, like, come out of the ground and are the women, but, like, they're mushroom monsters. Like, they're mushrooms, but they're, like, animated mushrooms. Like, they can't really speak or anything. And it just took some turns, because basically this story taught me men will still continue to be men given circumstances like that. It was weird. It was, like, humbling for the human race to read, and it was disgusting at times, which is, I guess, what you're getting into for horror short fiction. It was written well. It was, like, enjoyable to read, but that was an experience. Okay, we're gonna move on from that. I just wanted to touch on the fact that, like, I read it, because I know some of you guys have read it, and it was an experience. That's all. Okay. Ooh, okay. So I also read a book that I know a ton of you guys have been recommending to me. I've had it on my Kindle for probably 6 months now. I finally read Hooked by Emily McIntyre. This is her first of her Never After series that are all standalones of fairy tale dark romances. Like, she kind of just takes aspects of fairy tale villains, and she, like, plunks them into, like, the modern world and turns it into a dark romance. So Hooked obviously follows Hook, like Captain Hook from Peter Pan, and his relationship with Wendy. And I loved how she did this, because it wasn't a fairy tale retelling. It was just basically, like, inspired by that, because there wasn't any of, like, the actual plot that happens in Peter Pan. But it was definite, like, elements that we all knew. So this was, like, kind of a dark crime mafia gang, crime family, I guess I would say, story. And, like, pixie dust is, like, the drug trade that is taking place in this, and all of the characters are, like, slightly named after characters that we know. So Peter is actually, like, Wendy's dad in this book, and he is the bad guy. And we have, like, Tina Bell is obviously, like, Tinkerbell. So it was one of those stories that was just so brilliantly done. I loved how she, like, pulled everything together, and, like, the ticking of clocks and why Hook doesn't like that, and how that was woven into the story. I loved it. So I'm definitely going to be picking up Scarred next, because that's obviously the next book in the series that follows The Lion King. So I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It wasn't the best book that I've ever read as far as dark romance goes, but I just liked the whole villain element that she added to it, so I would recommend that series. I enjoyed it. It is very dark, though, so check trigger warnings for that one. Okay, this next book. I finally picked up a book that has been, like, intimidating to me for a while, and I don't really know why it was intimidating to me, other than it's a book that has, like, a following, like, a serious fan base. So I've been on this kick of, like, reading stuff that has been intimidating to me, and while I'm in this mode, I'm trying to just, like, knock them out. So I finally read The Gargoyle, by Andrew Davidson. So I had no idea what this was. I thought that it was, like, fantasy-ish. I had no clue what I was getting into. Also, this book is cool. I just realized it has, like, a peekaboo cover. Like, the heart. Oh! Like the Inferno! Okay. I listened to this. Can you tell? So, what is this book? The first half of this book, honestly, was one of the first books that ever reminded me of Chuck Palahniuk's writing, where it's very, like, gritty and crass and blunt with how, like, our narrator speaks about himself and life and his experiences. So it gives me Palahniuk vibes mixed with Neil Gaiman, maybe? I'm trying to think of authors that writes like this, but honestly, this is a book, like, in itself. So this is a story about a guy who we learn basically his entire life story over the course of this book, along with another character. But it's told, like, in present day, where the book starts off with him in a car accident where the car is on fire, and he is basically, like, burning alive. And then we follow his recovery in the burn unit in a hospital. And this woman who comes in to meet with him and claims that she knows him, and basically just starts telling him about all of her past lives and all of their relationships they have lived over the past couple centuries. So it's weird. It's nitty and gritty, and it spans like generations of time. So it follows him, like we're seeing the story from his perspective, but we are also getting chapters of Marianne Engel, who is this woman, and we're seeing like her experiences in the past and everything that she's lived through and what he went through with her in past lives. So we see her in like as a nun, we see her in medieval Germany in a convent, we see them in like more modern day Japan, we see them like over the years that spans through most of like medieval Europe. And a lot of what ties the story together is her relation and his relation to Dante's Inferno and how they play roles in that. And it basically discusses kind of like life and death in like immortal love. But it doesn't read like a romance, but it is. It reads like a romance that spans like decades and centuries of time, but in a very weird way. It was a fever dream of a book. Like, it was one of those things when I was reading it, I couldn't have told you what was happening in it, but after I finished it, I was like, I think that was a masterpiece that I just experienced. So this is a book that I've read it, I understand what the story is now, and I think I want to reread it probably in a year or two and see how much better it is, if that makes sense. This book has a diehard following. Also, this is a debut novel. The things that he pulled off in this book were very impressive. This was an experience. Okay, I'm saying that a lot in this video, but man, that one was a ride of a book. Okay, moving into fantasy romance, do I have a recommendation for you guys? What Lies Beyond the Veil. It's fantastic. This is so good. This is giving ACOTAR vibes. This is giving like From Blood and Ash vibes. So if you're a reader of those, I'm never going to compare books to those things because they have their own feel to them, but this book has all of the elements that like we like from those. So this follows a world where there is like a village of people and there is a veil that is between the humans and the Fae, and the Fae are terrifying monsters. We don't like the Fae, and the veil is what is protecting the humans from them. Witches created this veil centuries ago, and this is how we're living. But occasionally, I want to say it's like once a year, this is a very similar plotline that I've read in a lot of fantasy recently, just like the humans being protected by this barrier from the scary thing, and once a year something comes through it. But basically, I think it is once a year, people get Fae marked, and a bunch of these humans, basically all of a sudden these tattoos show up on them, and that means they are marked by a Fae to be the mate of one of the Fae, and the Wild Hunt comes and like gathers these humans and brings them back to their Fae lovers. It's a terrifying process. Like, the Fae are monsters. People don't want this to happen to them. So obviously this happens to our main character, and it is her story as she is like on the run, and she ends up finding a guy who has the exact same marking, so he was marked by the same Fae as her, and they end up falling in love, and it is their story basically like in hiding from the Fae and trying to figure out how to survive. It is raunchy. It gives me Poppy and Cass vibes, where we know there's more to the picture. Like, as a reader, you kind of are assuming that the hero in this book is more than we know because he's got a lot of secrets. He's very vague with his answers on things. We kind of know where the story's going. But it gave me Poppy and Cass vibes for that specifically. Like we all kind of knew who Cass was early on, right? But it also has the whole concept of like, he gets turned on every time she threatens him. Every time she holds a dagger to his throat, he was just like, oh, I'm into this. So if you're into that vibe, this book was so good. Keep in mind, it is book one of a series, and it does obviously end on a cliffhanger. It ends on a rough cliffhanger too. Like, I knew the direction the story was going, but I didn't expect it to go like the way that it went. It was interesting. I loved it. I read the whole thing in like one sitting, and it is a beefy book. So that's a recommendation that I have. If you are a fan of from Blood and Ash, like the character types of Blood and Ash and ACOTAR Fae vibes, this is a good one to keep your eye on. Okay, so I also just read Don't Kiss the Bride by Carrie and Cole, and this was a book that I was nervous about. So I've read a lot of age gap romances, and I am very particular about it. I don't mind age gap romances, honestly. Some of them are some of my favorite books. But it has to be done with stipulations. She has to be over 18. That's like my main sticking point. Some people are okay younger, or if the relationship like doesn't start until she turns 18, but we see younger, that makes me uncomfy. So my stipulations are she has to be 18. There usually has to be a reason that puts them together, and it has to be done slow burn. Like, we have to see it happen over time for me to have respect for it, if that makes sense. So Don't Kiss the Bride fit all of those things. It was done so well. Carrie and Cole likes her age gap romances, but some of them I like, some of them I don't. I devoured this book. I loved that it had a marriage of convenience in it for an actual legitimate reason. Like, there was a reason that they had to get married, and he wasn't creepy about anything at all, and she acted her age, which felt authentic to me, and I just loved her. Like, she had such a cool backstory that I related to a little bit too much. Probably shouldn't have related to her as much as I did, but her story was like really cool to see as it progressed, and then him healing from things in his past with her. It was done so well, and it was paced so well. It's a thick book. I listened to it and I didn't realize how long it was until I went to like mark it as read, and it was like 600 pages or something, and I was like, oh, okay. So I prefer my age gap romances to be slow burn because I want to see the tension build, and I want to see the relationship be like fought against and prevail anyway for reasons. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. So this is one of the very few age gap romances that I have the utmost respect for. It was done so well. Ooh, okay. I have a couple nonfictions that I read as well. So I finally read The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So I read John Green way back in the day, back when he was the king of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and all of his books were like all of the craze way back in like early pre-Twilight YA days. I read them. I didn't really like them that much. I had respect for Turtles All the Way Down because it was the first time that I had seen anxiety and like mental illness represented in a painfully relatable way. So I have respect for that book, but I've never liked his books. So I knew that he came out with this book, and I knew that it was vastly different. I knew that it was like a collection of essays, and it was an adult book. And I was like, I'll get to it at some point. I got to it. It's one of the best things I've ever read. Like, I didn't want to like it as much as I did, but I love the Green brothers. They're both so intelligent and well-spoken, and I've just been following them for years and years, since like early Vlogbrother days. But it was just a really cool glimpse into humanity and his perception of it, and also just like his experiences in life dealing with depression and anxiety. And like another thing that I related to way too hard, some of his essays about like things that he went through in his life when he was like being diagnosed with anxiety and with depression. I was just like, oh, I'm there now. So it was really well done. And it also just had some really cool thought-provoking things about society and about humans and how we react to things and why we react to the certain ways we do. Stuff like that is like my favorite type of nonfiction that just kind of like gets my thinker a-thinking. You know, it just makes me start like questioning things about life and like comparing and contrasting. It was great. I loved it. Okay, and the last book I want to talk about is a book that I just finished last night, and it was called A Killer by Design. And this is right up my alley. So this basically takes like the book and the show Mindhunter and delves a little bit deeper. So if you watched that or read that book, this is up your alley. Or if you're a big fan of like Criminal Minds, also up your alley. So this is the study of serial killers and basically the psychology of what makes a serial killer. Why do they do the things they do? So Mindhunter, I was obsessed with that show, and I'm still bitter that it got canceled because we never got to see the BTK storyline play out like they were setting it up to be. Here's a sushi. He just jumped up. Hello. So long story short, this is basically in like early profiling days when profiling started to become a thing that the FBI used in serial killer cases or just in criminal psychology in general, where they're trying to figure out like the early signs of the people who turn into serial killers. Like, can we predict this happening? Can we understand why they all follow patterns and why they all do exactly the things that they do, even though it's disgusting and gory and horrific? There are reasons why they do the actual acts that they do. So Mindhunter was basically the introduction of that back in, I think, the 60s or 70s, of them going around and interviewing serial killers who were still alive and in jail, and them telling them exactly why they think they did the things they did, or like just giving them really intense descriptions of the murders that they did and how they like cased the person, how they chose their victim, and why they did XYZ things to them, to basically form a criminal profile of serial killers. So this is basically a woman who worked in that field. She wasn't one of the people who would go and do the interviewing, but she was the person who like compiled all of the data and created this entire program of the BSU that we see like in Criminal Minds and whatnot. This is the real life person who did that. So it was fascinating to me, and she goes into like really intense depth over like specific serial killers. Like Ed Kemper is still one of the most terrifying but fascinating individuals because he's one of the very few outliers of everything, and she like discusses his interviews and why he is one that doesn't fit the mold and why we have ones that don't fit the mold, but most of them do. It was fascinating. So if you're a weirdo like me who's really into like the morbid life of, you know, serial killers and true crime stuff, 10 out of 10 would recommend this book. It was very informative and terrifying. I got home and made sure all of my windows and doors were locked that night. So, you know, it served its purpose. So those are all of the books that I've read recently that I wanted to share with you guys. I've obviously read a lot more than that because your girl's insane and reads a lot of books, but those are the ones that stood out to me, and I covered a lot of range this time. Like generally it's a lot of just romance, but this one was like romance and nonfiction and weird mind jump things and horror short fiction. It was a weird past 2 weeks that I've been reading, but this is my brain. This is my reading taste. It jumps around a lot. So hope you enjoyed this. Maybe you took some recommendations away from it, but that's gonna be it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in my next video.